Welcome back, dear friends, to a new episode in our series on how to polish your presence. As I've mentioned in previous videos, this series represents a personal tribute to Pierre Bourdieu, who, in his monumental work Distinction, compiled an extensive framework of interests and habits that separated affluent families from working-class ones. Bourdieu gathered his findings in what he called the four capitals: cultural, social, symbolic, and economic. A particularly thought-provoking conclusion he reached is that cultural, social, and symbolic capital each carry an economic component, as they can be converted to facilitate concrete financial gains. The fields of art curation, luxury, consultancy, or leisure make it very clear how taste leadership and mastery of social codes can constitute a competitive advantage. But what about capitalizing on our cultural literacy, social connections, and personal branding outside the narrow scope of our career? In this new episode, we're going to explore how we can attract such flows in our everyday lives. The battle plan we create will also help us understand Ensemble Learning and its three key methods: bagging, boosting, and stacking along the way. Bagging, inspiring a positive impression. Bagging splits training data into subsets, trains models independently, and then combines the results through voting for classification or averaging for regression. In real life, think of all elements blending into perception as the root of human subjectivity. In his book Alchemy, Rory Sutherland emphasizes the impact of seemingly small gestures. Think of how thoughtful a handwritten note can appear compared to something generic or automated. When we want to inspire a certain image, we focus on the following key parameters: N estimators, or the number of base learners. Think of the layers accumulated in an interaction: tone, body language, conversation topic, depth, and the likelihood of seeing that person again. Max samples, or the number of training samples per learner. We don't ambush someone, invade their personal space, or exaggerate cordiality. Bootstrap, or whether to sample with replacement. In life, this allows us to periodically assess the depth and substance reached in each interaction. Base estimator, or the weak learner corrected by the meta-learner. There may be no second chance at a first impression, but if we initially come across as shy, we can still allow our personality to shine later. N jobs, for parallel computation. Think of the butterfly effect and how our ease in navigating different circles or topics can open doors into new environments. Boosting, acquiring legitimacy. Boosting trains models sequentially, each new one correcting the errors of the previous. In The Economy of Prestige, James F. English offers insight into the dynamics and impact of reputation. Applied to life, the process begins by researching and identifying respected institutions that will become our new environments, whether think tanks, cultural hubs, or members' clubs. Once we enter these higher context environments, we continuously calibrate our knowledge and attitudes to acquire the flexibility needed to interact with fellow participants. Our presence in such spaces eventually leads to a subtle form of endorsement. Over time, this organic realignment, shaped through each conversation, allows us to build legitimacy to the point where our expertise is requested even in unrelated fields. Boosting operates with the following parameters: N estimators, or the number of weak learners. How many fronts must we be present on? Do we ask thoughtful questions as an audience member, propose ourselves as keynote speakers, or introduce ourselves during networking cocktails? Learning rate, which shrinks each new model's contribution. Think of how many interactions or visits it takes before we are recognized for our knowledge, depending on our personality and familiarity with the topic. Base estimator, or the weak learner. This reflects our initial status upon entering that environment, the knowledge we could claim, and the network we had at that time. Max depth, mind samples split, or model complexity control. As tempting as it may be, a new environment we wish to win over is never a one-person show. These parameters teach us when to speak, when to listen, what details to remember, and how deep to go into a subject. Subsample, or what we focus on. Erudition alone is not enough if we refuse to develop charisma, for example. Loss, the function to optimize. This represents the humility required to enter new environments, to absorb new information, and to delay self-promotion until the right moment. Stacking, presenting ourselves with intentionality. Stacking, or stacked generalization, trains different models and uses their predictions as inputs for a final model called a meta-learner. K-fold cross-validation is applied on each base learner prior to training the final dataset. In real life, stacking mirrors the process of curating your own interests and shaping a coherent worldview that ultimately fuses into your personal branding and highlights your expertise. Key parameters in stacking include base learners, or the different algorithms used in our models. Think of authors who made complex domains accessible. What was their signature touch? For example, Nassim Nicholas Taleb and Robert Greene both use historical anecdotes to explain risk and strategy. What areas are you truly passionate about that you can blend to highlight your uniqueness? Meta-learner, or the final model trained on base learners' predictions. This represents your personal brand. CV, or cross-validation strategy. Can we sustain this polished version of ourselves in every setting we may encounter? Pass-through, which determines whether to include original features alongside base predictions. Focus on your uniqueness, rather than trying to fit into a generic archetype. To conclude, dear friends, the most subtle economic outcomes often come through better introductions, more meaningful invitations, and opportunities that lead to trust, partnerships, greater negotiation power, and increased responsibility. If we want to capitalize on our knowledge and social skills, it all begins by placing ourselves in environments where we will be appreciated. Context is everything. Once inside, our efforts must reflect belonging, elegance, and emotional grace. Study psychology and cultural nuances to understand the circumstances that shaped someone's perspective. People want to feel understood. Approach others with critical thinking to develop an intuition about their goals and mission. Be the person who sees the bigger picture. Reading, curated exposure, and dedicating time to mastering social codes will get us there. But our main focus should be to never lose ourselves along the way. Let us also remember that both cultural literacy and access to diverse social circles reduce to one key asset: information. Neuroscience demonstrates how each new piece of information can be integrated in an infinite number of cognitive associations. Such dynamics dispel the myth that creativity is something divinely given rather than the product of continuous study. And finally, being attuned to premium contexts does not mean becoming performative. It means understanding elite codes, even if we choose not to conform to all of them.